In this series, come with me on a micro safari to explore worlds that are hiding in plain sight, and all without leaving my garden. Welcome to Hidden Worlds, my garden! What better way to kick the series off than with probably the most popular insects in the world, bees. And if you enjoy what you see, please like and subscribe because it really helps the channel grow. But in the meantime, here's a story about bees, but maybe not the one that you might expect. I was actually looking for ants in the garden when I noticed something going on with the cherry sapling. It had huge chunks taken out of the leaves. Almost every leaf had a bite taken out of it, yet there was no evidence of the culprits. I was pretty sure it couldn't have been slugs or snails, so I decided to watch and wait to see if anything might happen. Then suddenly this bee landed in front of me and did the most extraordinary thing. It began cutting a circle out of the leaf. Now, not surprisingly, it's called a leafcutter bee. They look similar to honeybees, but are actually very different. They don't live in hives or colonies with a queen, but are solitary bees, living alone, and this one is carving out small discs to make a nest where it's going to lay its eggs. They're looking for soft, fresh, flexible leaves, and some species will even target flower petals. I must admit, at first I was a little concerned about the damage the bee was doing to the tree. It did look rather dramatic. But then I noticed that the bee wasn't ever cutting through the base of the central leaf vein called the midriff, and would abandon what it was doing if it got too close. So despite how this looks, they found a way to gather materials without actually killing the plant. I wanted to spot where the bee was making its nest, so I followed its flight. It was pretty easy to see that it was carrying the cut leaves to a hole just above the handle of the garage door. They need a chamber about 4 to 8 inches long and around 6 millimeters wide to pack the leaves tightly. Once leafcutter bees have decided on a nesting location, they'll stay focused on building until their task is complete. And it's only the female that uses her strong mandibles, those sharp jaws, to precisely cut circles from the plant's leaves. The male's role is purely focused on mating, and once they've achieved this, they typically die shortly after. There are only 7 different species of leafcutter bee in the UK, and around 1,500 species in the entire world, and it's those robust mouthparts that give them their classification name, megachyle, which means large-lipped. Unlike honeybees that have pollen baskets, leafcutter bees carry pollen on hairs on the underside of their bottom called scopper, from the Latin for brush or broom. Females often have orange halos of pollen on their bottom, but because males don't have these hairs, they're less effective pollinators. She constructs the cells inside the hole using saliva to glue pieces of leaf to the walls, forming a protective chamber. Because they don't need to feed a growing colony, they don't make honey like other bees, but instead use a mixture of pollen and nectar as food for their offspring. She makes a pile out of the mixture in the chamber and then lays an egg on top, then seals the cell closed with more pieces of leaf. She'll repeat this process until the space inside is full of cells. The eggs hatch and feed on the pollen mixture over autumn, then pupate into adults hibernating through winter. Then it's the warmth of the spring sun that wakes them up and they leave the nest. It's been really enjoyable watching her in action, building away. But all of a sudden there was a different visitor. A new type of bee was showing interest in the nest. I didn't think anything of it at first, but then I noticed that the leafcutter bees were behaving strangely. They seemed reluctant to enter the nest. Something wasn't right. Because leafcutter bees are solitary and don't have a colony to defend, they tend to be less aggressive than other bees. But these two definitely seem to have a problem with each other. It may have been that they were both making separate cells inside the door handle, but I had been watching them all day and this was the first time I'd seen any trouble. Their entire demeanour seemed to have changed. I thought it was best that I gave him a little bit of space. I returned a short while later and it looked like a battle had taken place. Leaf discs were spilling out of the hole, scattered down the side of the door. The leafcutter was inside, but not building. Instead, was actively clearing out their own nest. It's possible that the two females were competing for ownership of the same nesting site, clearing out the other one's hard work so that they could build their own cells, but this didn't quite add up. And then that bee from before returned, and things began to make a lot more sense. It's a cuckoo leafcutter bee, and similar to the cuckoo bird, it doesn't build its own nest but takes advantage of others. This is called kleptoparasitism. They'll find where the leafcutter is building and sneak in, hopefully when the coast is clear, and using their pointed tail pierce through the leaf discs and inject an egg behind. The remarkable thing is that the leafcutter bees seem to know that their nest had been compromised and made the decision of pulling it apart to rid it of cuckoo bee eggs. Otherwise, the cuckoo egg will hatch earlier than the leafcutters and eat all the pollen and nectar stores. Cuckoo larvae are born with large, powerful jaws to kill the leafcutter's offspring, ensuring it has no competition for the remaining food. If a female cuckoo bee accidentally lays 2 eggs, the first to hatch will kill its own sibling to guarantee it can keep the pollen mixture to itself. To have both types of bees in my garden indicates a healthy ecosystem. A strong enough population of leafcutter bees to cope with both predators and parasites. I didn't see the leafcutter bees again on the cherry tree, and despite looking battered, it's doing absolutely fine. I'll have to wait until next spring to see if leafcutter bees or cuckoo bees emerge from the nest. Just next to the cherry tree, sunning itself on a picnic table, is a tiny little solitary bee called a furrow bee. At less than 1 centimetre long, furrow bees are ground nesting bees. They create underground tunnels by burrowing into soil. Each bee digs her own nest with a separate chamber for eggs, but sometimes the females will share the same entrance. This behaviour is called communal nesting. Like all our bees, they're incredibly important pollinators, and are extremely prolific in the garden at this time of year, busily collecting nectar, transferring pollen between flowers. I just love how their mouth parts extend like an arm to get access to that nectar. Moving away from the furrow bees, I headed to where the largest flowers in the garden grow. Passion flowers do well in my garden and are adored by the bees. They display some of the best examples of how a plant and bee have adapted together. The three purple stems at the top are called styles. On their ends are the stigma that collect the pollen grains. The base has dull petals, the central part the nectary, and the 5 yellow-looking sunshades are anthers releasing pollen onto the bees. You can see a clump of yellow pollen grains stuck to this bee's back as it tucks into the nectary. This plant's orange fruit is different to the passion fruit you get in the supermarket. It's supposed to be edible, but I'm not sure I'd recommend it. As a vine, it's pretty much dominated this wall, but I don't mind since the bees go crazy for it. And they don't seem bothered about me getting up close with a camera lens. The purple-coloured strands aren't actually petals, but are called the corona. Their purpose is to guide in the pollinators. It also acts as a handy platform for the visiting insects. As for the bee, well, this is the familiar European honeybee. With over 20,000 bee species in the world, it's only this small group of bees that produces enough honey to be harvested on a commercial level. But bees are not just useful for honey, they pollinate over 3/4 of global food crops and the vast majority of wild flowers. This level of mass pollination means they are integral to the entire food chain. If you remove bees, plants wouldn't go through fertilization, animals would lose their source of food, predators would have no prey to hunt, and the food chain would collapse. So we are equally as dependent on bees for survival as the relationship it has with this flower. Other insects can pollinate too, like this tiny fly dwarfed by the size of a bee, but the bee is built for it, with some unique behaviour and physical modifications. They found a way to communicate by performing a waggle dance back at the hive to let the colony know the direction and distance of a good food source. As the afternoon goes on, it looks like the waggle dance has paid off. The passion flower has become so popular it's a little bit overcrowded. So why do bees get so frenzied about nectar? Well, to a bee, nectar isn't just a snack, it's a high-energy fuel, packed with sugar, giving them the power they need to stay airborne and active. But they don't just drink it for themselves, they carry it back to the colony in a specialised second stomach called a crop. It's used only for transport, but allows a single bee to carry almost its own body weight in liquid nectar. And if nectar is a bee's fuel, then pollen is for growth, packed with essential proteins, fats and minerals. Pollen provides everything the bee needs for every developmental stage of its life. And bees have some clever ways to collect it. You might be able to see here that on their hind legs is a flat surface with stiff bristles called the pollen brush. It's used to brush pollen from their bodies towards their middle legs that have combs to scrape it all together. This pollen is then moved back to the hind legs, where a pollen press compacts it into a neat pellet. The pellet is then pushed into a pollen basket for the trip home. Then back at the hive, the pollen is mixed with nectar and saliva and packed into honeycomb cells to make a nutrient-rich food called bee bread. The mixture makes the pollen easier for young bees to digest, but also acts as a preservative, allowing it to be stored for a later date. A new customer has arrived, a common carder bee. The honeybee decides to make a quick exit. Equally as driven to drink nectar, they are one of our most common bumblebees, and there are loads in my garden. They belong to a group which is known as long-tongued bees, and they've evolved to be able to access flowers with long tubular florets. Unlike the solitary bees, the common carder bee is a social insect with nests that can have up to 200 workers. And similar to the honeybee, it also has pollen baskets, but its baskets are much larger. Positioned at the top of the outside of its hind legs, the pollen baskets are currently empty. On a day like today, it takes about 5 to 15 minutes to fill those yellow sacs. Here you can see them beginning to build up with pollen, but there's still plenty of space in them yet. Having spent some time bouncing between flowers, the carder bee returns and its pollen sacs are practically full, now bulging from the thigh of those hind legs. Giving those legs a bit of a shuffle, it's combing the pollen into place. The honeybee decides it's actually fine to share the flower with the carder bee, and together they go on the merry-go-round. Now we're into late afternoon, the flower is spilling out plenty of pollen and nectar for everyone. The carder bee, however, seems less willing to share and gives the honeybee a little kick to get it out of the way. The carder bee has had its fill and heads home, leaving the honeybee to carry on. The day is coming to an end and the sun is going down. The flowers in the garden have started to close their buds. Only on the passion flower, this bee doesn't seem to have quite got the message. As one final move for the flower to guarantee pollination, it slowly closes its bud and all its pollinating parts, closing the bee inside the flower. It's thought that the bee becomes intoxicated on the flower's nectar and is quite happy to spend the night on the inside of the flower. It's a bit like a lock-in. The bee hasn't been forced into it and could escape through the petals if it wanted to, but chooses to get free board overnight. And when the flower opens in the morning, the bee will return to their colony. For the flower, the pollen-filled anthers are now pressing down against the bee's back, and it can't help but brush against them as it moves around. Just look how much pollen is now stuck to the sticky ends of the stigma. Each grain can form a pollen tube to the central pod where a fruit will develop filled with seeds. Pollination will have successfully taken place, and all through this wonderfully mutualistic bond between flower and bee. One of the finest examples of co-evolution. I hope you enjoyed the episode. There are still loads of hidden worlds to come. Next time we're going to be looking at the spiders in the garden and the ways that they've adapted to catch a meal. But until then, get outside yourselves and see if you can find some hidden worlds of your own.